please. I need to be very specific. Punctual. Okay. Our next talk will be presented by Rik DE BUSSER. The topic is a four-way distance contrast in the Takbanuaz Bunun deixis. And let's welcome Rik.
Thank you. In contrast to the previous talk, I tried to make mine as simple as possible. So my title is also my conclusion, so you can all leave now. There's a four-way distance contrast in Takbanuaz Bunun deixis. But it's actually quite, when I found it, I was quite excited about this for reasons that might become clear a little bit later. Yeah, this is just the introduction. So Bunun is one of our Austronesian languages. And most of you who are sitting here probably know this. And some of you might also know that there are 5 extant dialects. This is a little bit relevant for the discussion. Bunun is a Philippine-type language, symmetrical voice system, complex verbal morphology, all this kind of stuff. But what is kind of maybe a little bit unusual in comparison to other Formosan languages, although in all honesty we don't have enough descriptive data available on all of them, is that Bunun dialects tend to have quite a lot of deictic elements, a lot more than many of the surrounding languages. And the data I'm going to present today is from the red dots in the center of the country. This is a map of Taiwan. The green area is Bunun territory. The green dots are actually where the actual villages are, which is a little bit different from where usually the maps point all or paint everything green. And I'm presenting data from Sinabalan, which is in the middle of the central mountain range, a small village in Nato County, Sinishan. And this is how the dialect tree looks. This is from a wonderful main thesis from Bata. But this tree already goes back to the Japanese era. What's important here is that we have a bunch of dialects. The southern dialect, Ishbokun, split off very early on. And then you have a northern and a central branch. And the central branch is relevant here because we're going to talk about the first dialect here on the central branch, Takbanuaz, and it's closely related to Takivatan, which I will mention a little bit later on as well. Now, distance distinctions in deixis, I mean, they're not really common, but cross-linguistically, there seems to be a fairly strong tendency towards 2- or 3-way distinction. So you normally have proximal distal or proximal medial distal distinction. And according to Walls, which is selective, I mean, it doesn't contain all the languages of the world. If you take the 2- and the 3-way contrast together, you have about 90-ish% of the world's languages. Maybe that's a little bit underrepresented if you take into account that they might not have sampled enough small languages to talk about, and that's not up to me to decide. Now, 4-way contrasts are a lot less common. About 3.8% of all languages should have a 4-way deictic contrast. So quite, not that many. There is previous research on deictic on deixis in Bunun dialects. I already said they have relatively complex deictic paradigms in comparison to other Formosan languages. And that's probably also why people like me have written on them, because they're easy to find. There are lots of different deictic elements, but it's easy to write on this. And there have been fairly large descriptions, or fairly considerable descriptions on Ishbokun, the southern dialect, and Takivatan, the central dialect. Takivatan was done by me, so that's easy. And what we can say is that there is quite a lot of difference between dialects. So that's something I want to point out, because people often speak about things like the Bunun language or the Rukai language or the Paiwan language, but dialects have actually a lot of languages have quite a lot of dialectal variations in these systems sometimes. And in the 2 dialects that have been described, there seems to be a 3-way contrast and a visibility distinction, which is quite interesting, but not that common. So this is what I found for Takivatan. I probably have to reanalyze this a little bit, but by and large, this makes sense. And what you can see is that there is a 3-way distinction. Hopefully, oh yeah, I can do that. Yeah, it works a little bit. There is a 3-way distinction between the proximal, medial, and distal forms, and then you have a whole bunch of paradigms I'm not going to go through them. You have bound and free paradigms. You have something that I called in my PhD thesis third-person pronouns, but probably they're they form like demonstrative forms that I actually should reanalyze. And then you have a set of at the very bottom of our table place words, and these are actually the same problem as Professor Lee's verb-like elements. Let's call them like this. That's probably the easiest way to get rid of them, so that they look like verbs more or less. All of them have a I-un-a distinction: proximal, medial, distal. And what is the medial really means is a bit more complicated. It usually means within the same delineated space. So, for example, within the same village, within the same house, within the same thing as the speaker is, within the same boundaries as the speaker. That's the thing. And then Lillian Lee, she wrote a PhD thesis in 2018, and she also she described bound and free demonstrative forms. The bound forms have a case distinction, and the free forms as well, and that both of them also have a distance distinction between three types of forms: proximal, medial, distal. You have the same thing for three forms, but there's also a visibility distinction there. And the difference in visibility between the two dialects will already become clear. I'll explain this in a minute. But there are in both dialects differences between visible and non-visible forms, but they're manifested in different ways. A couple of general observations here. First of all, and it is not really common, this distinction between proximal, medial, and distal forms transects word classes. So you have bound demonstratives, two series in both of the dialects. You have free demonstratives, you have possibly third-person pronouns, and then you have locative directional verbs, and they all have a distinction between these three distances. All paradigms have form, person, and case distinctions. In Takivatan, this is not clear, but that's what I said. I probably have to reanalyze this paradigm. And all of them, both Takivatan and Ishbokun, have a distinction between visible and non-visible forms. But in Takivatan, this only occurs or appears on the free pronouns and on the free demonstrative pronouns or forms. And it's the difference between a prefix or a prefix n versus 0, with n being the non-visible forms. And in Ishbokun, the visibility distinction seems to only occur, or has only been described for the bound demonstratives. And what seems to happen is that the distal form seems to kind of collapse, or like distal and non-visible semantics. And this, you can also see this in Takbanuaz, in the other central dialect that I'm now going to describe. So here I put this in a bit of a schema. So you have this three-way distinction. In Takivatan, it is I-un-a, and in Ishbokun, it is in-un-a. Interestingly, formally distinct, but they're still quite closely related dialects. And then the only other thing I have to say here is that in Takivatan, that's at the bottom, in one of the central dialects, the free singular demonstrative pronouns, they have a very interesting form, and I call this the underspecified form, just because it doesn't have a suffix. And what is it? So you have AP, this one, IPUN, this one, medial, IPA, that one, and IP, the one. It's a bit like French se, right? It's like it's demonstrative, but it doesn't distinguish in distance. That's how I interpret it. And here's some contrastive examples. So you can say, Sida IP, this is a mother talking about her child. This one here takes things and beats them against something else, as children do this. They said beat things against stuff. This one here is a good guy, or he's a good man, or something like that. And the eighth one here is medial, and here it kind of means that this person doesn't necessarily need to stand next to you or something. This is something that we can't discuss here, but the medial form is also used to express emotional closeness. So somebody that's related to you, like somebody you feel good about, somebody you can evaluate in a positive manner. And then the example 3 is Nyaktuba Ishna, Epa ma ludak su'u. I did not tell him this. He, so it's a epa, that one, beat you himself. So by himself. So I don't know where this example came from, but I have lots of examples of people beating other people. So this is something people like to talk about. Yes. And then 4, you have this underspecified form, and then he says tupaka nekto, and then the one says. And this is something that you see in things like stories very often, where the one doesn't really matter where he is. Now, I discovered 2 years ago, I was doing fieldwork with my students, that in Takbanuaz you actually have a different set of forms that comes up. And you remember in the central dialect, Takivatan, you have I un A, proximal, medial, distal. And Takbanuaz is another central dialect. You have the I un A that comes back systematically in the paradigm. But then you have these forms at the bottom. And I call them for now vague. Not really sure if that's a good term, but it's U, a form ending in U. So you have actually ki kun ka ku, I un a u, iti, itun, ita, itu, and then these iti forms, and they're quite common, and then ap, ipun, epa, epu. And then for the plural forms, and for these forms with isti and iti, the u forms, they're not acceptable to speakers. So it's they're not there. Now, there's no evidence of this the underspecified forms like takivatan, where you don't have a suffix. So you might say maybe that's the same thing, but it's not really. Because I asked my consultant, hey, what are these weird foo forms that suddenly come up? Because I've never seen them before. And he said, well, they indicate that something is somewhere at a distance, but you can't really say where. I mean, it's impossible to identify. And he gave some contrastive example. If you ask the question, for example, ma pepi, that means what is this? And it's something that you have in your hand or something that's really close to you. If you say ma epun, what is that? That's something that's in the same area as you, for example, on the table next to you or something, or in the same room. Ma epa, that's something that's far away, or the epa here. So you could say for example, if you hear something in the mountains, you can say, oh, there, I heard or I saw something flying there over that tree. What is that? But then ma'epu, and this is not a very common form, means what is that? Suppose you hear something somewhere and you can't really know where it is. The distance cannot be really imagined or identified. You use this ipu form. And I thought this was interesting, so I kind of started asking if there were other forms, and you can see that these also occur with all kinds of bound forms. Like the example 9 has the u, which is a bound demonstrative, which occurs on a verb. Demonstratives in Bunun can occur on verbs. This has something to do with word class distinctions. We can't go into this. If you want to talk about this more, maybe we can do this after the talk somewhere. But you can say something like maka paklimutu, and then the answer is lukis mukala. It's like, what is that clanging now noise? What is clanging there? It's wood, it's falling down. And this is like an example. For example, suppose you hear something, you say, there is something, it's not close to me, but I'm not really sure where it is. What's clanging there? And a similar example in 10, what strange sound is that? You can't really think about what this sound can be, and you can't really identify where it comes from. You would say something like maka kalingaku. And all the examples up till now were in questions, but you can also have this in normal declarative sentences. You can say something like, and this was my consultant talking about Usain Bolt, because they're fascinated by running, Bunun people. So he says like, Haida itu tang-aon to palamangan ng matalis to Bunun. I've heard that there is somewhere a famous person who can run very fast in some faraway country which we don't know where he is, but he exists in the world somewhere. That was the idea. So I was using Bolt. I said, okay, and then 12, Meshna itu epa mitsuma, where did they come from? Suppose somebody visits you in a village and they come from a strange country, but it's really not clear where they might have come from, or aliens land in your court here. That's where you would use Meshna itu. So a couple of general observations about this. Normal Bunun dialects have a three-way distinction. Actually, many Formosan languages seem to have two or three-way distinctions. But in Takbanuaz, somehow this fourth form comes up. And you have to be a bit careful because often people find out interesting things and then you say like, yeah, but I can't find it in my data. It is not really a very common set of forms. And I also asked the people in Finland, like, yeah, but it's not very common. It's relatively rare. And the consultant we talked with said, well, mainly these forms are used by people over 80 years old. And this younger speakers, they don't use it anymore. It's kind of a general problem. Elizabeth also referred to this. The language is disappearing quickly. So if we want to find the most interesting grammatical phenomena, we have to be fast because they will disappear in the next decade or something. And the interesting thing about the other interesting thing here about this distinction is that it's partial. So it occurs on some of the forms. In some of the forms, I can't find any attestations. In some paradigms, the speaker says, yeah, that doesn't really exist here. So you can't use this like this. Now, why did I think this was interesting? Well, it's always nice to find new things. So it's kind of, that's why you do field work very often. But it's also interesting because I always assumed, and many people with me probably, that the central dialects of Bunun, like these branches, these large branches, you have dialectal distinctions, but we always assumed that the distinction between these dialects were minimal. And this is maybe not gigantic difference, but it's larger than you would expect. I mean, it's a big difference in the demonstrative paradigm if you have an extra distinction. There are also various formal differences between Takbanuaz and Takifatan. I can't go into now. But for example, this visibility and visible versus non-visible forms, they also shifted around in the paradigm a little bit. And then the interesting other thing I thought, and I still need to investigate it a little bit, is that in Takifatan you have these underspecified forms. They seem to be different from these vague forms in Takbanuaz, although they're closely related dialects. And how I would describe this or define this is that these underspecified forms in Takifatan, they indicate that you just don't need to make a distance distinction. So I mean, it's a bit like, as I said before, French "ce." You can say ceci and cela, but you can also say just "ce," and that's just it. You don't need to make a distinction with the same with close or far. The vague forms in Takbanuaz, they're different. They mean that it's somewhere far away, but you can't really say where it is. I mean, it's also there's nothing to do with visibility. It's just like something is unimaginable in an unimaginable location somewhere. And then the things I still have to solve are a couple of questions that I want to answer but couldn't really. Is that first is diachronic implication. So, for example, this four-way system, is this actually the original system that then reduced to a three-way system, or did Takbanuaz innovate an extra distinction in their demonstrative paradigm? That would be quite an interesting thing because it would have needed to have happened quite recently, well, in the last 200 years or so, or probably much more recent. The other question why I found this interesting initially, these forms, is that in Bible translations and also in Ishbukun, you have a form that comes up every time over and over again, and it's itu. And itu is, by Lillian Lee translates this as belong to, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't really mean belong to. I told her that as well. It seems to be a form that is used to express politeness or reverence of some sort. And you can see this in the Bible translation. Well, it's not the latest. There's a new Bible translation already since this year. In the 2000 Bible translation, you get things like, our Father in heaven would be itu damatiqanin, or itu sasbinatiqanin, and then the Lord Jesus is itu sasbinat, itu Yesu. This itu means the venerable Jesus or something like that. It's not really translatable. But it's used for God, Jesus, important people like kings and stuff like that. I also found this, and I didn't know this, but I looked through my corpus of Takifatan Bunun, and I actually found examples here. You can also say, Miss, what is your Bunun name? So Talbinawa, itu Bunun, what is your venerable Bunun name or something? I'm translating here freely. Or you can say, So it was, indeed, it was thought that we, Bunun, the general part is a bit more, because it's more like a reverential interpretation of Bunun, should not forget this. This is about some kind of important rules they need to. I'm not really sure if these forms are related to these school forms in Takbanuaz, but it would be interesting if they were. So, conclusion, my time is up. There is a four-way distance distinction in Takbanuaz, just as data packet set, so that was the most important thing to report. There could be a relation to other forms in other dialects, but it's clear that in other dialects this distinction does not really exist anymore in a systematic manner. The diachronic implications of this are not really clear at the moment yet. And then I would also like to say, and this is something I always have to remind myself of, if you do research on a language, you have to be really careful about closely related dialects, because even if there are relatively small differences in paradigms, this can actually shift the whole thing. So you get completely different interpretations. So. And the other aspect that I thought was quite interesting is that the demonstrative functions and forms in Bunun dialects seem to have differentiated relatively quickly over the last century or maybe 1.5 centuries. And that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Right.